everyone, and welcome to Black Literature, Black History. This is Jason Williams. I know that I said that the next video that I was going to present was going to cover post-colonial literary criticism. However, as our children and our students are going to begin school pretty soon, high school and elementary school, I developed a list of questions that our children should be asking their teachers to make sure that they're qualified to be teaching the subject, and also to ensure that some form of Black American or African American history and literature is being covered in class, other than the normal Martin Luther King civil rights marches and so forth. So I developed a list of questions. So these are questions that every Black student needs to ask their teacher in order to know if their teacher is qualified to be teaching that subject. In English class, our students and our children should ask about different forms of literary criticism. If your teacher is teaching English class, they should know about the different forms of literary criticism to ensure that you're reading these texts that they're going to be presenting to you in the right form. Your teacher should know about new criticism, which has been debunked or is no longer practiced, but you should know why. They should be asking about, you can ask about new historicism, post-colonialism, deconstruction. How does Foucault's analysis of power fit into literary criticism? Because this is a very important point. You need to ensure, along with the support of your parents and your peers, that some form of African American text is being criticized during the year. Some form needs to be read, analyzed, and criticized using some literary criticism, some form of African American text. Because African Americans have been involved in the literary discourse of the U.S. since the beginning, ever since the Puritans. For example, Phyllis Wheatley was a poet during the Puritan era, and she was a very good poet, and her poems were very much on point and showed an extreme amount of intelligence. So in English class, some form of African American text needs to be analyzed, because we've been here since the beginning. And we've been creating some very strong literary pieces that shaped the form of America and America's literary scene. Okay, and I want to emphasize post-colonialism, new historicism, and deconstruction, because these discussions will introduce you into the postmodern way of thought in which we are currently in. And it's the view of powers that these forms of criticism will make your teacher have to show you how power and discourse is involved in creating like literary canons and why people think certain ways. So make sure you ask your English teacher about these different forms of literary criticism. And if you have to do a book report, Black students, if you get to choose the text and do a book report, make sure that you do it on some African American text. Just make sure that you do that. This is not all. If you find that your students or your class and your teachers aren't covering anything that has to do with African American anything, then it's your job to do it. It's not your time to be all inclusive and be all embracive and kumbaya. If you see that nothing about your culture and your people is being covered in class, and you get the chance to do a book report, you have to pick some form of African American literature, and I got many examples on my videos that you can look into. And then that will be the point where you can ask these questions, and you will enforce your class to pay some form of attention to some form of African American literature or history if you choose to do and autobiography, and I have some recommendations on the previous video. Okay, in history class, if your history teacher or social studies teacher, I'm going to combine social studies and history because usually these are the classes where they put in the football coaches and the baseball coaches and the wrestling coaches who don't know anything about anything to teach these classes. So if your teacher comes in there and has the nerve to say that Christopher Columbus discovered anything, right there that teacher is not to be trusted and is not qualified to be teaching that class. That myth has been debunked many years ago, and if you want to challenge that teacher, go online, look up Christopher Columbus's journals, which have been translated to English, and they have the original versions also online for free. Skip to the part where he landed in the Caribbean and just read something to your class or to your teacher about his discovery of people who were already here. So, but with that being said, when Christopher Columbus sailed to the Americas, the first one to sea land from his ship was an African. So we were even involved in that pirate ship that came over here and started to destroy the Native Americans. We even took part in that, which is not to be proud, but we were here. So in history class, whenever any era is discussed, you need to ask your teacher, what about the black people during this era? And I'm going to cover some eras right here. Okay, during the Revolutionary War, you need to ask about Crispus Attucks. Crispus Attucks was supposedly the first one to be killed in the Revolutionary War, and he was an African American. And you can ask about why was slavery stricken from the Declaration of Independence. Recently, during the 4th of July, I was listening to some commentary about the Declaration of Independence, and it actually addressed slavery in its original form, but before it was verified and ratified and distributed to everyone and accepted, verses about slavery were stricken from the Declaration of Independence. So ask your teacher why, and then that will get you into the discussion of what black people have to do with the Day of Independence. And while you're on that topic, you might want to ask your teacher if it's possible for the class to review Frederick Douglass's analysis of July the 4th and why black people shouldn't be celebrating the 4th of July as a day of independence because slaves weren't free, so everyone wasn't free. And then you should, while you're talking about slavery, you should ask your teacher, why don't we review some slave narratives so that we can learn about slavery from the slaves themselves. These narratives were very well written documents written by the slaves talking about slavery, what went on during slavery, and their journeys from slavery to freedom. Male, female, American slaves, and Caribbean slaves. So you can ask about Frederick Douglass, which is pretty much well known, but you can even ask about Harriet Jacobs, whose writing is actually superior to that of Frederick Douglass. However, it's not as widely distributed and as widely read because she's a female. But female slaves had to encounter certain difficulties that male slaves didn't have to encounter. Therefore, her writing had to be more superior than his when analyzing these topics, because during that time period, you couldn't just write as explicit as we do nowadays. So, and then don't let this topic of slavery go away without asking about the Reconstruction. Because people like to think that once Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves, which there's a lot of controversy in that, but once he freed the slaves, that everybody was free. But then during the Reconstruction, those slaves that were freed, the majority of them had to go to jail because during the Reconstruction, they passed a law that if you didn't have a job, you had to go to jail if you didn't have some form of employment. And what was the qualification for a black American to not have a job? I know that sounds kind of weird what I just said, but if a white man came up to you and said, you don't have a job, then that meant that you didn't have a job, right? Whether you had a job or not. So you get sent to jail. And once you get sent to jail, once your time period up is in jail, you get up out of jail, you step out of jail, they say, do you have a job? No, of course you don't, because you just got out of jail, so they put you back in. So in many forms, during the Reconstruction era, it was harder for black people during that era than it was during slavery. Because at least during slavery, you had some form of value or some form of price, you were property, but in jail, if you died from overwork, they just replaced you with another inmate. And today, there are more blacks in prison now than there were slaves. And if you know about the 13th Amendment, slavery was abolished, save imprisoned people. So convicts and people that are in jail are still slaves today, which is why the majority of our jails are full of black people. And then you need to ask about the Spanish-American War and what black people had to do with that, which I just covered what happened during the Philippine-American War, which was right after the Spanish-American War. Ask about David Fagan. Ask about what the black soldiers used to encounter when they were enlisted in the Army. Ask about the racism that was going on during the war. And you need to ask this about every war. So when you get to World War I, ask about the Bonus March. Ask about the Bonus March and how the blacks participated in the Bonus March when President Hoover sent out the U.S. military to attack the veterans of World War I. Black people participated. There was an actual John Hall who was murdered by the police when they opened fire on the bonus marches, and he was African American. And during World War II, before World War II, asked about the Berlin Olympics and who won the gold medals during the track and field events, who's just swept the track and field with gold medals, why they were there, what they were there for, to debunk Hitler's theory that the Aryan race was the superior race. And then ask about those gold medalists, track and field stars, how their reception was when they got back to the United States. And don't just take the teacher's word for it. Look up online in I believe it's in the Holocaust Museum, they interviewed some of the gold medalists when they returned from the Berlin Olympics and hear from their mouth how they were treated when they returned to the U.S. with no respect at all. As a matter of fact, none of the veterans in any of these wars or anything were treated with any more respect while they were overseas trying to represent America with the hopes that they're going to earn some type of respect from the people in the U.S. once they get back. And then, while you're covering World War II, ask the teacher, why were the bombs, the atomic bombs, dropped in Japan instead of in Germany? There were actual Jews in the U.S. who were pleading with the U.S. to drop the atomic bombs on the concentration camps in Europe to end the concentration camps once and for all. However, the U.S. dropped bombs, the atomic bombs in Asia because they would never drop any atomic bombs in Europe because Europe is full of Europeans, which are their descendants, white people who fight to keep white supremacy in power They knew the destruction of these bombs, so they dropped them in Japan because Asians' lives aren't as valuable as Hitler and the Nazis' lives, even though they were the ones who were the biggest perpetrators of the war. And they'll tell you that, well, it's because of Pearl Harbor. However, you need to, don't let your teacher just talk about Pearl Harbor without really investigating what went on in Pearl Harbor and what really happened there. And that's still not a good enough excuse. If the U.S. wanted to enter the war, they needed to enter the war and hit the targets that were the strongest points of the war. Japan was not the strongest instigator of World War II. Now, this is the thing. During the time that the U.S. dropped those bombs in Japan, on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they took cameras into the concentration camps to show people the horrors and everything that was going on in the concentration camps. You see all the starving Jews and the concentration camps and all the suffering and just the mounds of dead people and all of that. However, they did that on purpose to take your attention away from what went on in Japan after those bombs were dropped, because atomic bombs create the worst disaster known to man in a short period of time. They had those cameras over there in those concentration camps. You see dead bodies, while in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, those cities were just obliterated. There wasn't nothing to see. And then after those bombs went off, Japan suffered from the vapors and the residue of those bombs for many years to come. That needs to be covered. If you go over World War II, ask those questions. Okay, so now a few more questions to ask that I've written down. Okay, so when you get in the era of 1898, ask about the Wilmington Race Riot. When you get to 1919, ask about the Chicago Race Riot. 1921, ask about Black Wall Street. Always ask about Marcus Garvey. Ask about Martin Luther King and how his philosophy changed. Don't just let them talk. Don't let them just give you the I have a dream speech. Also get into this section about where he said that he changed, that he believes that he is leading his people into a burning house. His dream changed into a nightmare before he was assassinated. So make sure that that is mentioned as well. And ask about Malcolm X. Ask about the Black Panthers. Ask about Emmett Till, and even talk about music. Ask about Billie Holiday and Strange Fruit. You know, ask these questions. Ask about the American Colonization Society. Ask them about that. Those are questions that you need to ask your teacher to make sure that something about your history is covered in class. And get the support of your parents and your peers. And I wouldn't ask you to do this if I hadn't done this when I was in high school. And I did do it while I was in high school. And we had an organization set. And during Black History Month, we did succeed in the high school playing the Eyes on the Prize videos in the morning instead of the regular morning announcements. And a funny story that happened is when they showed the Eyes on the Prize videos, I have a friend of mine that I went to a school where there were only 32 Black people in the high school. But he said that when he saw the Emmett Till video from the Eyes on the Prize, he said he didn't talk to white people for 4 days straight. That means he didn't talk to any teachers, because all of our teachers were white. He didn't talk to any coaches. He didn't talk to any of his peers that were white because it bothered him so much. But these are the things that need to be seen. And then we had other things in our high school, such as Cultural Dress-Up Day, where everybody dressed up wearing their native gear, their native colors from the country that they wanted to represent. And we had other things also. I don't know, I doubt if any of that stuff is going on today, because we were a little bit more revolutionary than the ones that are there now. However, if you continue to ask these questions and do these things, things will change. And I gave a speech. Remember, I only had 32 black people in the whole school, but I gave this speech one time, and I named it after one of Malcolm X's speeches, like "Who is the enemy?" And I went through how Europeans committed genocide and colonized every different continent on the planet that they visited. And of course, the white people were calling me racist, and then all the black people, before I even got out of class that day, even though I gave the speech that day, by the time I was walking out of class, before I got to my next class, I had about 5 or 6 black people asking me for a copy of that speech because they heard how racist my speech was. But they wanted it because they were interested. So to gain power in your classroom, ask these questions and don't let your teacher off the hook. Again, this is Black Literature, Black History. This is Jason Williams. Have a nice evening.